Nonprofit MBA purpose is to provide new business insights and fresh creative ideas for executive directors and their teams that will help them improve their organization. Here is your host, Stephen Halasnik.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Halasnik. I'll be your host for today's Nonprofit MBA Podcast, and I am co-founder of Financing Solutions. And for the last 15 years, we've been the largest provider of lines of credit for small nonprofits in the United States. If you're interested in learning more about a line of credit for your organization, please visit our website at nonprofitmbapodcast.com. Today, I'm very excited to be speaking with Dr. Lindsay Whorton from the Holdsworth Center. Today, we're going to be talking about founder to senior executive director, how Lindsay has, what she's learned in building a nonprofit that started from scratch and now is at a $30 million mark. And we're going to be kind of focusing a little bit more on the skills that she's learned that are important to help an organization grow. Dr. Lindsay Whorton, as president of the Holdsworth Center, a nonprofit dedicated to building stronger leaders for public schools, she is the author of A New School Leadership Architecture, which calls for a fundamental redesign of how leadership roles are structured and practiced in schools, offering a bold new blueprint to make jobs sustainable and give teachers the coaching and support they need so that their students can thrive. Lindsay, welcome to today's Nonprofit MBA Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm going to jump right into the deep end here. And if you had to have like a one sentence to describe what you are like now as an executive director from a skill standpoint versus where you were when you first started, what would you say that it is?
Well, I think my sentence would be your title is the same, but your job is different. And the pace at which you are getting a different job with the same title as you move from a brand new organization to a much more established large organization is a really rapid change. I don't even know if I could compare in one sentence the job I have now to like my first job. But I think there are these kind of chapters where you have to constantly reinvent how you think about your role and revisit where you need to be spending your time, the skills you need to develop, and like the mindset, you need to bring to your work. So I think that has been kind of the challenge and what keeps it so interesting, even though you've hypothetically got the same job.
Do you miss those days when you were doing the founder's work?
I think in one background I'd give, so the background I'd give, just to give some context, I met the person who had the vision for our organization, Charles Butt. He's a big advocate for public education in 2015. And my first job was actually just to help him put together like the business plan and the strategy for what this thing could be, and I thought I was just going to do that and kind of leave it in his hands and go on and do something else. And he convinced me to move to Texas. And, I had my first job at the organization. We started serving about 7 school districts. We had a team of about 20 in 2017. And then I moved into the president role in 2019. And it still had a lot of kind of small startup, new energy, when I moved in to that role. And I think what I'd say is there's something really beautiful and special about like each chapter of an organization's life. And there are things that I loved about those early days. And there's lots of like great opportunities in the new chapter. So I think it's like a both and of like, I really appreciate that and really feel excited about like where we are now and am embracing like the opportunities that like this chapter and this season brings. But it's easy to get nostalgic,
Yes.
for like when you're smaller and like, and I think that nostalgia can be a bit of an enemy. So I think you got to be a little bit careful about that.
Yeah, I mean, me personally too, going from various different companies, a founder at various different organizations or companies, and then building it to a much larger organization. The nostalgia, I agree with you. but I do feel like once the organization is much more established, you can breathe a little more.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's a little bit more, you get to work on things instead of working in the organization so much. And that's, I think most founders are trying to get out of being the early startup phase where they're doing everything. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's funny. The book that I wrote was about school leaders, and draws some inspiration from a book we used in our program for a long time called The Leadership Pipeline. I mean, I think it has this really powerful framing of shifts that leaders need to make as they move through their career. And they talk about like three different kinds of shifts. One is like, what are the new skills you need to either develop or lean into and use more as you shift? The other is, how do you need to spend your time differently? But the third, and it's like the hardest to pin down, but I actually think it's the most important, is where do you need to have shifts in your professional identity? And I think a professional identity is like the highlight reel that you have at the end of the day about like the great things that you did and the way that you made a difference and the stuff that makes you feel good about yourself. And I think when organizations are small and when you're in kind of that scrappy startup mode, you've got your hands in everything. And like for us, I mean, we're a service organization. You're getting to interact like with people that you serve all the time. And it's like so rewarding to be the person doing the thing and delivering the product or delivering the service. And I think that when people get so attached to that form of value, it can be hard to transition into the new roles that you need to play, which is creating the conditions for other people to be able to do the work. And so I think what trips people up is that values attachment that you have to how good it feels to kind of be in the center of everything. But to your point, there is this like extraordinary other opportunity, which is if you can do your new job, if you can help create conditions that allow the organization to serve people well at a greater scale, and which requires you to set up other people to do that work, then you get this reward of like how remarkable it is that the organization can take on new challenges, that it can, like all the things the organization can do kind of become the reward. But I think it takes like real work for leaders to let go of some of the things that have been so rewarding and valuable to them about those early stages, and then give themselves time and space to find value in new things.
You talked about control, but going from the early stages of the nonprofit, what did you have the most difficult with that as your characteristic traits, so to speak? I can't think of a better word than that, but your skills. Where did you struggle the most going from a smaller organization to a larger organization? What was difficult for you?
Yeah, I think there were probably two big things for me, one of which doesn't have that much to do with size, but just has to do with like my own personal leadership journey and the kind of evolution of the organization. I really loved like kind of being in like a number two role. I got to do all the things I loved most, which was like really think about the work, think about the strategy, think about how to make like the work and the impact better. And I also was very like down and in the organization. I was thinking about our people, and I was thinking about like the people that we served. And for me, the transition to taking that responsibility for being up and out, was a big transition, and coming to really find value in, feel confident in, and really dedicate time to building the organization's brand and reputation, for being visible in different places, for using, my voice in the world. That really was a big transition for me, because I'm not somebody who seeks out, the spotlight. And I was really lucky to have a board that had incredible seasoned leaders from a bunch of industries who really challenged and encouraged me and just kept the thumb on the scale of like that expectation. And that was really critical for me to really make that transition. So that was one. And then I think the second is like when we started, We had 15, 20 people, and like 19 of them were program people, were folks who were doing the work. And most of your like back office functions, like IT, HR, finance, all these things, either just didn't exist or were like outsourced, and we were small enough where that could work. And so the process of bringing in all of those important support functions and getting them to work in concert with our programs and to not become a really bureaucratic organization, like that has been like a big curve that we've been on, for the last 4 to 5 years. And I do think that, especially if you're somebody who got into this work through kind of the mission, the strategy, the program, the product of the organization, building the knowledge that you need, and coming to appreciate the importance of all the work you need to do to set up those systems and processes, I think is a big leap.
If you were to think of an inflection point, let's say when you went from 3 million to 10 million in revenue, yearly revenue, so, it doesn't need to be that, but, can you point to one of the top things that helped you make that leap?
For me, I actually think the inflection points that I measure were all about our headcount. So that's how I felt. And obviously that's highly correlated, with revenue, because staffing is, a huge percentage of our budget. But we went through a period where we basically doubled in size twice in like a 3-year period. So we went from like 20 to 40, and then we went like 40 to 60, 60 to 80 pretty fast. And that happened during COVID for us. And to me, because like our mission and strategy is all dependent on like the quality of the people that we hire, their alignment, and like the culture that we have as an organization. That's where I really felt kind of that transition. Because for me, what I noticed is the way that I had engaged, tried to build, and tried to sustain the culture when we were 20 people was dramatically different than what that needed to look like when we were 40, 60, 80. And I eventually realized that the shift that had happened is when we were 20, I could almost maintain the culture through my own personal one-on-one relationships with everybody. And as we got bigger, and then as our context changed, through COVID and different ways of working, I had this realization of like, I could not personally be the carrier of the culture of the organization anymore, and really had to figure out how to make sure that every manager, that we had in the organization was equipped and ready to do that work. Otherwise, we were really going to lose ground in terms of some of the things that made us great. And so that's where I really experienced kind of the big shift in that chapter. And then I would say for us, there was a second big shift, which we had kind of plateaued, we'd kind of leveled out in terms of our kind of staffing model, our overall revenue model. But then we made this other big transition, which is we went from having one main kind of, for us, it's a program, one main product that we were scaling, to then diversifying and offering kind of more products and services. And that was another big change in the organization of like, how do you help the organization understand the strategy as you are now doing more diverse and more complicated things. So that's the second place that I think we really experienced that.
Did you find that, I know with me early on, I had to learn better how to hire people, how to hire the right people, how to set expectations correctly, how to have job descriptions, how to have an identified culture in place so they knew, the culture of organization. Did you find that you did a good job early on in hiring, or was it a learning experience for you too?
I think it's a both and. I think we did a very good job from the beginning of investing time and energy in finding and retaining the best people that we could from the beginning. I think that was probably one of the things that we got right. I think one of the biggest challenges that we had in hiring honestly. And I don't totally know what the solution is to this. What I experienced is that jobs, it isn't just my job that was changing, over the last like 10 years, but particularly when we started, we hired somebody to do something in 2017. And what we needed the person in that position to be able to do 2 years later or 3 years later was actually dramatically different. And so I think the biggest mistake that we probably made early on was hiring for like the needs of the moment. Like what exactly do we need this position to do for the next 6 months? And not being able to see honestly well enough, like what do we need this position to grow into over the next 2 to 3 years? And I think that was the biggest challenge for us at the beginning. There was a point where, and it was about 5 years in, and this is related to size. Early on, I was involved in the hiring of every single person who joined the organization. And and I have my own flaws and limitations. So it's not to say that like I'm a perfect, hire, but you had some consistency, in how the process ran, what you were looking for, how you thought about kind of skills and mission alignment. And when we got big enough, I reached this point where I realized it is not sustainable for me to play that role in hiring. And we didn't do a great job initially of really being explicit about what needed to be true in our hiring processes as they were held by more people. And so after about kind of a 12 or 18-month period, we recognized that we were maybe a little too inconsistent, and we've put a lot more effort into really codifying from beginning to end how we want hiring to work at the organization. And that allows more people to be a part of that process and get a consistent outcome. And so that was the other kind of key lesson for us.
What was a big jump in revenue? What was the cause?
For us, our increase in revenue has just matched an increase in service. So when we started in 2017, we had a pretty robust 5-year plan, because one of the things that's really unique about our organization, I feel really lucky for, we had a 2-year planning period before we started. And so we had a kind of 5-year roadmap, the details of which, nothing plays out exactly according to your plan. But honestly, the kind of revenue projection, we ended up hitting it pretty close, through our first 5 years. And so we had a plan when we started to say, we're going to start relatively small, with 7 districts. And then we had a kind of scaling plan in place that was matched with our revenue and costs. So for us, it was really just like we had a plan to grow the organization, and we executed that. We had to make some adjustments to our scaling assumptions. There were a lot of lessons learned there. But then I think once we got kind of to the end of that 5-year period, we started asking questions around where we go from here. And that's where we started to kind of diversify our programming, and we grew kind of beyond the original forecast that we had when we launched the organization.
If you're, let's say you have an executive director who's listening today, whose organization is like around $500,000 to $1 million, or a couple of years into it, and they're a new executive director. They're not new to the organization. They're the founder or the executive director, and they what advice, knowing what you know now? I know you don't know the nonprofit. That their own particular nonprofit, but in general, what's the advice that you would give to that person?
I'm a big believer. I believe that long-term planning is useful, not because your long-term plans are correct, but because it gives you better ideas about what you might do. It makes you better at anticipation, and it makes it easier for you to respond to opportunities, as they come your way. And so I'm a really big believer. I believe if you're the head of an enterprise, it's your responsibility to be thinking on a 3 to 5 year time horizon perpetually. And I think if you're brand new into the role, you're probably not going to get to 3 to 5 years right away. I think that's okay. You may have like a short-term list of things you just kind of need to get done. But eventually, I think you should be constantly refreshing like your vision of what 3 to 5 years could look like. And think it's really useful to think in scenarios, to say like, what would kind of be our, like, my most aggressive, in terms of scale, growth, revenue version of what the organization could look like, would be a moderate version. And then what would be like my worst case, scenario. And one, I think it can help you refine your sense of like what is actually possible. It can help you think through like what would need to be true, in my organization for us to operate in A scenario, B scenario, and C scenario. And a lot of times you're going to discover some things that are in your need to be true list that are common to A, B, and C. And those are things you should certainly start doing, So I just think carving out this time to think long term and not feeling a pressure that your planning has to be right, or that you have to know everything in order to develop your plan, but really thinking kind of probabilistically and in scenarios, I think is really energizing for executive directors or CEOs. And I think it makes you far more creative, far more agile in how you do your work. And I think that's the biggest thing we sometimes get wrong about planning. I think some people do planning in a way where it's like, and then once I develop the plan, I'm like locked into that plan, and the plan makes you rigid and it makes you unresponsive. And I think there's a different way to think about planning.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I do that too. I think, but you said something before that might stop one from doing that, and it is if you come up with different scenarios, right? If you come up maybe with, if this happens, what would our plan be? If this happens, maybe if you don't think of the goal first, it doesn't lock you in as much. I completely agree, with strategic thinking. I would almost take every week for about an hour over a cup of coffee at a coffee shop, typically, to kind of go over my strategic plan. And for me, it always has to be in writing, just so that I can kind of understand and update and see where we are and make changes and those type of thing. And I love that hour and a half. It was one of my favorite things to do, So I usually ask this in the beginning of every conversation for the last 2 years, but I forgot to ask it, and I'm going to bring it up now. How has this current administration affected your organization?
So we're based in Texas. And we're focused on Texas public schools. And so when we think about like the conversation around public education, like across the country, there's a lot of things. As I interact with my colleagues like across the country, I think there's a lot of things that have felt new to them when the administration came into office a few years ago that were already true in Texas, and so in that sense, there wasn't as much that felt different. We also are not, our funding sources are not, we have not taken any kind of federal government grants, and we don't rely significantly on government grants of any kind. And so I think that probably has buffered us some from some of the turbulence and change, that has happened in the sector. Probably the biggest thing that's on the horizon for us is, and this can get a little in the weeds, so I'll keep it, but there are some changes being contemplated to the funding that public schools receive from the federal government through title dollars, in particular. And if some of those sources of funding become unavailable, those are the sources of funding that districts use to pay for professional development and all sorts of other services. And so I think the big thing that we're trying to do is understand how the districts and schools that we serve are being impacted, by some of the shifts in policy and in funding. And then we just have to figure out how we're going to be responsive to that. But we're a little bit less directly connected to some of the changes that I think are impacting, other nonprofits who may rely more significantly on government grants.
I'm going to put you on the spot here. We talked about planning. Have you gone through the scenario if that funding for title had, I don't know if it's Title IX, I don't know if it's something
Title
else.
II. Title II is
II.
big. Yeah.
So Title II, if it does go away, have you gone through that scenario?
Yeah, so we do both. I mean, our planning cycles in the organization, we basically have like an annual cadence where we kind of do long-term planning, and then we do a lot of sprints, around scenarios. And so the summer of 25, Congress was having discussions about potentially eliminating or significantly reducing Title II dollars, which are these dollars that districts use to pay for professional development, et cetera. And so we went through a scenario of like, what if those dollars completely go away? And what if they go away on this timeline versus this timeline versus this timeline? What would we do in response to that? And so we built out all those plans. We didn't end up needing to make any major adjustments to what we were doing, but again, it increases anticipation and like responsiveness. So every time we kind of see something like that on the horizon, we kind of go through a process of thinking through what our actions would be.
Cool. Got it. What is something that keeps you up at night right now?
My answer to that, which is always the same, and then I'll try to think of, I mean, honestly, and I think this is probably true for almost everyone in every sector of kind of the nonprofit space. There is, when we think about public education, there are wonderful things happening for kids in public schools every day, and we need to tell those stories more. And we have so much work to do, to make schools places that consistently, for every kid, provide them with an experience where they feel joyful coming to school, where they feel belonging, and where they get what they need, to have the skills that they need to unlock their potential and to live great lives. Like, we have so much work to do, and we have so much work to do to make schools places where the teaching profession is like vibrant and sustainable and attractive. And so I'm really like proud of what our organization is doing, but there isn't like a day or a week that goes by where I think like we did enough, like there's always a gap between the need and the importance of the work and like what you're able to do like each week or each day. And I think learning to live with that sense of like perpetual dissatisfaction, is the challenge. Because on one hand, like if you dialed it all the way down, you'd like feel better. But you wouldn't have like the right motivation and energy and sense of purpose to come to your work. But also if you allow it to just like burn you up, then you can't sustain yourself and you become discouraged. And I think our first board chair was Ruth Simmons, who's an just acclaimed higher education leader. And like one of the pieces of advice that she gave me that I have just found so helpful is like in every moment and every opportunity, you just have to figure out like, what are you good at? What are the capabilities that your organization has? And like, what is the next best thing that you can do, in response to the need that exists? And you can't get overwhelmed with trying to answer the question of like, whether it's enough, to tackle like everything that you're seeing. You just have to figure out what that next step is. And I think that's been like a really good anchor. I think probably the timely version of that is I do feel really worried about it feels like I think there's so many fractures across our country. There's so many things that used to be points of common agreement, that are now divides. And I think public schools are one of those things. I think that's an area where we've had common agreement for a really long time. And it feels like common agreement around public schools being important, how we should invest in them is really fracturing. And I do worry about that. And I think, we all in that space have to figure out what role do we need to play in rebuilding trust around our public schools and like making them, a place that we can rally around across the country.
What is the number one thing that the teachers so every state has a different culture. So in Texas, from what you've seen and I'm sure it's part of your programming for leadership, what is the number one thing that teachers in Texas which are, saying to their leaders, is their biggest concern?
I think it's hard to come up with a number one thing. I'll give you like a handful. So, I mean, I do think teachers are leaving the profession for a variety of reasons. But I think you can boil down a lot of the reasons why teachers leave to them basically saying, like, I care deeply about this mission that I'm trying to accomplish, and I don't feel successful on a daily or weekly basis. I don't always feel like I'm given the tools, the resources, the time, the support that I need to achieve the goals that I'm being tasked with. And I think when you're a mission-driven person, if you feel like you are not able to achieve your goals, I think that just like eats away, at you. And so I think if you kind of break that down, I don't think we provide our teachers with like enough support, training, encouragement, time within their day to like think deeply about their practice, to prepare. I mean, U.S. teachers spend more time delivering instructions to students and less time on like planning, collaboration than almost any other teachers around the world. And I think that is getting more challenging in our post-COVID environment. Teaching is one of the most regimented, jobs that you can have. You're driven by bells. You're on this really tight schedule. I mean, teachers a lot of times like getting to the bathroom's challenging, getting to have time for lunch is challenging. When we think about knowledge workers and all the flexibility that so many knowledge workers have, we've got to figure out how to give like more flexibility, more autonomy, more room to breathe, to our teachers. Pay can certainly be better, and should be better for our teachers. And then, I think that their teachers feel it when teaching and education is at the center of our political debates. I think you feel challenged, you feel distrusted, you don't feel supported by your community. And I think the sense that people are suspicious of you or don't think highly of you, I think wears away at people. And so, I mean, I also think just like lifting up teachers and giving them the respect and honor that they're due. Would be like my 5.
Yeah. I mean, I have 2 sons. So for me in New Jersey, I'm in New Jersey, and in New Jersey has excellent school districts. And they, it's to me, it's a morale. It's morale. Yeah. So that's why leadership is so important at schools, because, that's the role of a leader.
Yeah.
To address that topic. So it's tough. I completely get that this is a challenging time. Well, it was a great podcast today. I really enjoyed my conversation with Lindsay Whorton from the Holdsworth Center for coming on today's podcast. And, also you can also pick up her book, A New School Leadership Architecture, if you'd like. And if you are interested in learning more about a line of credit for your organization, please also visit our website at nonprofitmbapodcast.com. And Lindsay, if anyone wants to reach out to you, how would they go about doing that?
The best way to find us, if you search the Holdsworth Center, it'll take you to our website. We're on most social media channels. You can find me on LinkedIn. So any of those routes will get you to us.
Great. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks so much.
So, the taping of this is the middle of the summer. And I just want to thank firstly our listeners for trying to make this world a better place. I know Lindsay and I are doing it in our own special way, but you guys are out there in the front line on a constant basis, and we need you. This is a tough environment to make the world a better place, and we need you to be at your best. So I just want to remind you, just remember that you're no good to your cause, your employees, your family, nor yourself if you aren't taking good care of yourself first. because, solving these world problems is a marathon and not a sprint. And if you're burnt out, then you're not going to be very effective. So whatever you need to do on a daily basis, think of yourself, whether that be exercising, meditating, praying, meeting a friend for a cup of coffee, whatever it is, make sure you're thinking of yourself first, because we know there's a lot of unselfish people in this business who are really trying to do great things. Other than that, I want to thank you for listening to the Nonprofit MBA Podcast, and everybody have a fantastic day. I'll see you later.